Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. It's Sunday, the 14th of Elul, 22nd of August. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently studying the Seches, Shabbos, chapter 7. We are on 73b Ayin Gimel, Amud Beis, in the chapter in the parak of Kol Gadol. We've been talking these last few days about a new category of an unintentional Shabbos desecration, or really an unintentional act overall. Misasek, where a person is doing something with their hands, but there is a distance or a detachment between what the person's mind is intending and what their hands are doing. Although if you'll do a man on the street thing in shul, will stop a person and say, hey, would you call this a shogeg? Certainly that would be our instinct. But for the purpose of the laws of Shabbos, we are drawing a distinction between an act which is unintentional in the sense that we didn't realize it was prohibited. And if we would have known that it's prohibited, we certainly would not do so. And something that you didn't realize you were doing, or it wasn't what you, or it's really more than that. It's not just you didn't realize what you're doing. You were not intending to do that act. In this subject itself, or in this matter itself, there is a difference of opinion between Abaya and Rava, how far to take this principle of misasek. And so Abaya limits the application of the principle of misasek, as we've seen and we will see. And Rava is a little more expansive on the subject. Friday and Thursday, for that matter, or Friday primarily, that was devoted to the analysis of a brisa that was introduced by Rava to make the case that misasek would be exempt. And the brisa was the contrast of Shabbos and other genres of Jewish law, other mitzvot. In certain regards, Shabbos is more strict, more severe. In certain regards, Shabbos is more lenient. For the purpose of our discussion, Shabbos is more lenient in that there are times when a person would be off the hook on Shabbos for a given act, but they would not be off the hook for that very same act had it been done, but they would not be off the hook with the similar conditions for another mitzvah. Let's share the screen. I want to peek one last time at that price, and then we're going to go into the answer which we saw briefly on Friday, and then we'll move on from there. So here is the brisa. And also just want to change. Did I share the screen? Yeah, the screen is being shared. The Tanya, Chaimer Shabbos Mishar Mitzvahs, Chaimer Shar Mitzvahs Mishabbos. There are stringencies of Shabbos over other mitzvahs, other mitzvahs over Shabbos. Shabbos is more strict in that you would bring two offerings, two chatases, even if the two malachas were done in one lapse of awareness. On the other hand, Chaimer Shar Mitzvahs Mishabbos. Other mitzvahs are more strict about Shabbos. Shebeshar mitzvahs, shagag b'lei miskaven chayiv. Other mitzvahs, the absence of kavana, one would yet be chayiv. That would be considered a shogeg. Mashen kim Shabbos. In the realm of Shabbos, we have this unique notion of misasek. And if you recall, Rashi tells us v'chat haba, there has to be a greater degree of intention, awareness, kavana, that you intend to do what you're doing. This is the brisa that triggered all of our discussion, primarily in the first half, contrasting or attempting to establish which item we're contrasting to Shabbos. The Gemara ends up saying, hold on. Gemara ends up saying,
hold on.
Elolav. We had to skip a few lines to get to the final answer. Elolav. Reisha B'Avodah Zarah, the first half, which is saying that on Shabbos, two different acts under the same heading of Shabbos desecration would get two chatases. In Avodah Zarah, different manners of worship would all only warrant a single chatas in atonement. The Seifa, the latter half that talks about a leniency of Shabbos, primarily in the realm of miskavein, bishar mitzvahs. This is talking about other mitzvahs, where generally loy miskavein is considered a shoygig. In Shabbos, loy miskavein gets you off the hook as far as being classified as a shoygig, which needs a carbon chatas. The Gemara, that's the answer. The Gemara is now going to workshop this final point and come up with some creative solutions. And then when we're done with that, we're going to explore other components, other areas where Abaya and Rava have a similar disagreement about how far they will take the misasik, how far they'll take the absence of intent, and the hands are doing something other than what the mind imagines it is doing. But this is the punchline. This is the final answer as far as deciphering of the brisa. So the Gemara now asks, give me. You told me other mitzvahs. There could be the absence of. There could be a misasik. There could be the absence of. There could be a shoygeg without miskaven, no intention, or an opposite intention. Give me the details, says the Gemara. What are the details? The savar, the shuman. Well, maybe we're talking about a scenario where a person is about to eat. Oh, are we talking about a case where a person is being served a beautiful shuman scoop, and he's chayiv? B'Shabbos the pater. The savar, the shuman hu v'achalei. Rashi. Hainu the shagag, the savar shuman hu. Okay, so shuman means fat. Chelav means fat. What is the distinction between the fats? Well, shuman means an average random kosher fat. Again, we have people here in the medical field. It's probably, in general, not the greatest health practice to swallow down scoops of fat. I'm just imagining. But there's no halachic problem with eating shuman. There is a very grave issue with eating chelev. Those are the prohibited fats that the Torah precludes us from eating. They're in the temple times burnt on the altar and otherwise not consumed. So what is the scenario of the shoygig miskaven? The savar, the shuman hu v'achalei. That the person was under the impression that it was shuman, it was fats that are kosher. V'achalei and ate it. Rashi. V'hainu the shaga. This is the shoygig. This is the inadvertent, unintentional part. The savar shuman hu, he thinks he's eating shuman. V'lo niskaven lechol chelev, and he does not think, he is not intending to eat fats, v'chayiv, and yet he would be chayiv. He would be liable. It's a shoygig. He didn't intend to do it. He's not going to get kares or whatever the other legal liabilities are, but he does need to atone with a carbon chatas. Although Rava would view this act of thinking one and it being something else to be classified as misasek. Why? Because he's not intending to eat this prohibited food, he's still chayiv. And the Rashi quotes the Gemara in Krisos, which we've quoted a few times, that says when it comes to prohibited fats and when it comes to prohibited relationships, misasek chayiv, you don't get a waiver for misasek. Shekenen, because in this circumstance, the person, maybe he didn't realize that it was not kosher, but he enjoyed it. And similarly to illicit relationships, his unintentional doesn't mean that he didn't have the experience. Aval b'Shabbos pater. On Shabbos, however, when a person is doing an act, misasik, kavana is entirely removed, and he doesn't intend to do it, and he's not intending to do what he's doing. Deloy he actually isn't benefiting sufficiently or properly from what he's doing, because he's not doing what he needed to do. When you're hungry and you want a scoop of shuman that need is satisfied even if it's chaylev. On Shabbos, that is not necessarily the case. So again, the Gemara asks, what is the scenario that by Shar Mitzvahs, gave our example. You thought you were reading Shuman Yetfat. Mashen Kim Shabbos the Potter. Because we know our brisa taught us, the person has the intention of cutting something that is detached. Or I shouldn't say our brisa. Rava tells us that if a person intends to cut something that is detached, in other words, anytime you chop a vegetable in your kitchen or whatever, what are you doing? You're being chaytech, you're cutting tolush, that which is detached from the ground. That's not a problem. You have to be mindful about how you cut it or when you're going to consume it, but that's another story. But there's nothing wrong. Now, and you ended up chopping a cucumber that's still on the vine, let's say. Your potter, that is the contrast between Shabbos and other mitzvahs. So now we've attempted to present the brisa. Again, if you're feeling confused, I want you to remember, there was a brisa that says Shabbos is different than other mitzvahs. Sometimes Shabbos is more stringent. Sometimes Shabbos is more lenient. The previous conversation was how Shabbos is more strict, and it had to do with multiple chatas, multiple offerings. This is when Dr. Hammer asked us about our extensive focus on the don'ts and the atonements and the sins and the details at the end of Friday's class, which was a good comment, and I'm glad you brought it up. Now we address the second half, which shows that Shabbos is more lenient, and it's more lenient in the shagag b'lei miskaven, in the area where there's no intent. The Gemara says, what's the scenario? Simple. You thought you were eating one thing, you ate something else, you would be chayiv, but on Shabbos, you thought you were cutting one thing, you cut something else, you would be exempt. So the Gemara now reminds us of an inconvenient problem. And I'm telling you, we're almost done with any degree of complexity. The rest of the Gemara is going to be fairly straightforward. What's the problem? The problem is Abaya. Why is Abaya a problem? Abaya is the one who taught us not long ago that miskaven lachtach esatolish v'chatach esamechubar. You thought you were cutting A, but you ended up cutting B. You intended to do the act. The subject of your act is not exactly how you anticipated it. Abaya does not give you a waiver. Abaya says you're chayiv. So Abaya now needs to defend his position or at least Abaya has to give us his version of the brisa. Where do you have a case that Shabbos is more lenient? According to Abaya, Shabbos is just like any other mitzvah. Although you didn't have kavanah to do so, you didn't act that is prohibited, and you have to bring an offering. So now we're compelled to talk about a less appetizing scenario. Pardon, I beg your pardon. The savar roiku, the person thought that he was just swallowing saliva. Ubaloy, and he swallowed it. What did he swallow? He swallowed shuman. So we had to find a hypothetical in the prohibited unkosher foods that one would be off the hook. I'm sorry, one would be chayiv by a non-kosher food. I'm saying non-kosher food, but I mean fats, by not having kavanah, in a manner that on Shabbos you would be exempt. And the scenario he needs to give is that you had you had something that you understood was your own spittle. Now there is no, so in Jewish thought, in the Gemara's thought, swallowing saliva, your own saliva, is not considered eating. It's a different genre, it's swallowing saliva. But swallowing fats is eating. And so not only is the subject of your consumption different than you intended, but now we look at the act that you have done as a separate act. There's swallowing saliva and there's consuming foods. Under such a scenario, one would yet be chayiv for chaylev. But on Shabbos, he thought he was doing act A, lifting something up. He ends up cutting something. Then not only is the subject of his action different, but his action is not what he intended. Now he is patur.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Doesn't Gemara discuss what happened before he swallowed? Because for the forbidden fat to turn out in his mouth, he had to put it. He had to do something, and whether he did it by mistake or whether he did it knowing that it's forbidden fat, or what are other circumstances might be of importance in deciding this issue, what to do with how to treat the swallowing of this fat.
No, indeed, and this is where my appetite is ruined, because my sense, without wanting to go so far into it, is that there's saliva or other bodily fluids that typically are found in the mouth that are not in the mouth, and he's re-ingesting it.
Saliva is involuntary.
Correct. But here that's why I'm telling, my understanding is that there is saliva or other phlegm that is removed from his mouth. And now for some reason, and again, I apologize, he is intending to re-swallow that. That's highly unappetizing if you ask me. But if he thinks that he's re-ingesting or not ingesting, he's swallowing, he's putting back into his mouth saliva or phlegm that had been removed from his mouth. It's not advisable, it's antisocial, but it would not be considered eating in the very bare bones halachic definition of eating. So eating or consuming saliva or even taking back saliva is not considered eating. But it ends up being that it's actually a food item that is classified as eating, and it's also a prohibited food item. And so although he wasn't even thinking that he's going to be doing an act that's called eating, it's determined to be called eating, he would still be chayiv if ultimately he ingested. What chayiv? He would want to atone, he would need to atone with an offering for such an event. Again, highly unappetizing and also a little bit, probably not a super prevalent situation. But yet that is how Abaya would need to explain that, or how Abaya would need to present a case where the person thinks he's doing an entirely different act and consuming in a different subject or a different item, but he ends up doing a different act, eating instead of swallowing saliva, and it's prohibited. Professor, I hope I clarified. I agree with you that this is in my understanding, and maybe we need to dig deeper, a little bit of a stretch, but that's the case. Professor, I want to hear your comments, but Beryl wants to say something first. So Beryl, go ahead, please.
Yeah, don't forget he's also doing something because he always had the option to spit it out.
Right.
So he is taking an action.
Indeed, but the question here is that Abai and Rav have a disagreement about when you call something shogag v'lo miskaven. When do you consider an act that is or let's use the word misasik. When are you off the hook for doing an act that is removed from what your mind understands you are doing? You think you're doing one thing, you end up doing something else. So your kavana is absent and your awareness is absent, but it wasn't because you didn't realize there's a problem. Abaya says it only would work when you intend to do act A, but you're doing act B. In other words, Rava says as long as the subject of your action is not what you thought it is, you're off the hook. You thought you're eating Coke, and really you're drinking blood. Pardon for that as well. Rava would say, okay, you thought you were drinking one thing, you're off the hook. Abaya says, no, you intended to drink and you drink. That brings your kavana too close to the action. We're not going to call that that's called a shogeg. You have to do an atonement. So because Abaya needs the action to be different, he's compelled to come up with a more out there scenario. Belia, swallowing, is halachically classified as a different act. Or I shouldn't say halachically, the Talmud is classifying the act of swallowing as something apart, or I should say, swallowing saliva is different than the act of eating. And so that's how Abaya would have to explain this. I hope that clarifies things. Hold on. Dr. Hammer, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, this reminds me of an opinion, and I remember the rabbi who gave it, a young liberal Orthodox rabbi, who said that on Yom Kippur, it was acceptable to rinse your mouth with mouthwash and spit it out. I won't go there, but I'm saying it just reminds me when you're talking about the difference between phlegm and this and swallowing and not swallowing. And of course, there weren't too many people who I think agreed with him, but it was a public statement by an Orthodox rabbi in a synagogue in Manhattan. It goes back about 10 years. So it was an interesting concept because, of course, one of the things that people are concerned with on a fast day, and particularly on Yom Kippur, is the odors and this and that. Anyway,
Doctor, to point out, that is one of the advantages of mask wearing on Yom Kippur.
I'm glad you're in favor of mask wearing on Yom Kippur. I wanted to get to that, but I didn't want to bring it up. I did when you went away for a minute. I asked Mark if there were any accommodations being made, but you don't have to go there now.
Without going down that road, the intention is that there are going to be sections where people can sign up to be in an area where they're pledging to wear their mask and be in the company of people wearing masks.
So,
but I don't. The elaborate discussion on that matter will be after the shir. Rabbi Beryl, go ahead, but please let's not talk about masks on Yom Kippur.
Once Bernie took us to Yom Kippur, what about swallowing spit on Yom Kippur? That considered eating?
All good, Shilas. I do want to say, by the way, I don't want to go down that road right now, but suffice it to say the commentaries who are attempting to understand the opinion of Abaya and the commentaries who attempt to understand Abaya with the reading of Rashi do discuss what exactly is happening with the spit. Is it problematic when the person puts it in their mouth, or is it the swallowing? So you're actually onto something. Let's read this Rashi, and then I want to go on. I want to go to the part that I told you is going to be fun, or at least a little easier. Abaya would say that the aforementioned scenario, he thought it was Shuman and it was really Chalev. He thought it was prohibited fats, and it's permitted fats and it's prohibited fats. That's Chayev. A Jew would have to bring a chatas on Shabbos. Dilab misasek, that's not called misasek. That's not called mindless action. He's doing the act he intended. Only the subject is different. Hechidami misasek, the shar mitzvahs chayiv. So now Abaya, again, Rashi is just explaining the Gemara. Now Abaya is going to be compelled to present a scenario where other mitzvahs, one would be chayiv, and on Shabbos you'd be pater. Kasavar roiku. So a person's eating something that he thinks is spittle. Shehaya chelev nimoyach, but really it was melted fat. Ubloai, and he swallows it. His intention is not to do the act of eating. Because spittle, saliva, is not considered eating. It's considered swallowing. So you could swallow something, but to be classified as achila, eating, it needs to be a food substance. And Rashi brings proof from Job that describes ad bali ruki also build it. Anyways, the bottom line is it makes that swallowing spit is not considered eating, but also build the achila. But what he ends up doing is eating. He's not intending to eat. The Kabasei b'Shabbos potter, and on Shabbos, a similar case, one would be exempt. So we're not saying this is a common event. All that Abaya has done is he's proven to us that there is a hypothetical that could fit the classification of misasek, where on Shabbos one would be exempt, but with eating chaylev one is not exempt. That is the case, and I'm sorry if I ruined your appetite, but that is the Gemara, and that's how Abaya would read this text. Rava, let me say this, because Abaya's answer is such a stretch, and it's really a kind of an obscure and unlikely scenario, Rava reads this brisa as a proof to him that there is a more expansive application of the principle of lemis asik to include a case where a person intended to eat one item, but he's really eating something else. A person intended to do a certain act, or he intends to do an act with a specific item, and it ends up being something else. What he intended to do was permissible. What he ends up doing is not permitted. According to Rava, that's considered misasek. According to Abaya, that is not considered misasek. Let's so that's the conclusion of the analysis of the brisa that Rabaya brought in support of his opinion of the more expansive definition of the exemption of misasek, of doing an act while intending to do something else, that Rava says you're exempt. Well, the halacha says that you're exempt, and Rava says you're exempt even in such a scenario. I hope we've taken something away from that discussion. And now we're going to see some other cases where Rava and Abaya similarly disagree. Sorry, Professor, we didn't allow you to have a response. Did you want to say something? You're muted. we still don't hear you.
But I thought that the context of this discussion was even more important than the discussion itself. That is the scenario how this piece of forbidden fat turned out to be in one's mouth is even more important than what to do after it turned out in his mouth. Because if he did it by shogeg, it's one thing. If he thought it wasn't Shabbos, or if he thought that, oh no, Shabbos is not important. If he thought it was a regular fat, or it wasn't fat at all, or if he wanted to put one thing in his mouth and wound up putting another thing is his mouth. That is what I thought should be an important topic, because that really affects what happened after this piece of fat wound up is in his mouth.
Right. Now, I need to make a final comment. I don't know if I'm directly responding to you, Professor, more to the doctor's comments on Shabbos. You know, if you sit in on a class about the law, you would come to think that Americans are super, is the word anxious or obsessive, and they can't do a single act without considering a whole variety of scenarios. And if you were an alien from outer space and your first exposure to civilization is in a legal class, you would think that the average day in a human being is entirely obsessed about the nuance of every step you take. The reality is that when you're examining the legalities of a matter, you need to examine it and explore from every angle. And so you can come to find yourself stretching your imagination to find a hypothetical such as what we've discussed. And this is important for the Gemara, which is ultimately a text that's going to assist us in understanding the law. But I don't believe that is to say that we necessarily need to live our moment to moment and day-to-day life with this degree of conscious scanning and thinking. I think we need to live our life attempting to be consistent with our values and consistent with our traditions, and avoid things that are not consistent with our values. But I think there's a way to distinguish between the academic and important halachic discussions that we're entertaining and the way we actually live our life in Jewish practice. Now, granted, those that are prone to obsessive, or I should say those that struggle with an obsessive kind of way of dealing with life certainly can be triggered and can have a challenge with this this type of exercise. But I just want to make the comment that there's a distinction between, so for example, a person that makes a mistake and they want to figure out how to deal with it after the fact. They go, oh, I made a mistake. They can go to their rabbi or their bezin or our application, and then they're going to have to now, think back and ponder different nuances about the action. But I don't think the Torah is telling the person necessarily that they should live their life in this constant, you want to eat, you make sure it's kosher, but you don't have to, So I think that's an important thing to add, especially in the context of this discussion, which again has taken us very, but this is again an intellectual exercise and a mental exercise, and we're getting our minds intertwined with the value of Jewish living and the importance of it, and for that reason we'll take it to this level. Now let's go into some light reading. Itmar, a familiar discussion. What happens, on Shabbos, in addition to many restrictions we have not discussed, and some of the restrictions we have discussed, you might recall in the beginning of our Masechta, we talked about how we shouldn't carry something in the public domain. Carrying doesn't just mean it's in our pocket or in our hands, but it also means we shouldn't cause something to traverse certain distances, namely 4 amot in the public domain, or from jurisdiction A, domain A to domain B, from a public domain to a private domain, or to a private domain to a public domain. If you recall, that was the opening discussion of Masechta Shabbos, and the Mishnah had imagined it as 2 individuals that are interacting, an ani and a malabayis, right? So now what happens if the person intended to do an entirely acceptable thing, to cause an object to travel 2 amas? That's not a problem biblically. That's not prohibited. The Zorak Arba, but he ends up being not the greatest arm. He's not so good at predicting. He's probably not going to get signed, if for the basketball team or football team for that matter, or baseball. But it happens. Not everybody's so good at sports, and so he thinks he's going to have this very precise 2 amma throw. The Zorak Arba, but it ends up traveling 4 ammas. What's wrong with 4 ammas? Well, that is a distance that's prohibited to do on Shabbos. So the question is, I know we can peek at the text, but let's think. Are you chayiv? Your kavanah was to do a permitted act. Your hand ultimately did a prohibited act. Are you liable to bring a korban? Are you considered a shoygig? Or is this considered misasik? And you should be off the hook. Let's read Rashi. No, not yet. Rava Amar, predictably, Rava is going to say, Potter, you are exempt. What you did is not what you intended to do. Abaye Amar Chayiv. Abaye says, no, you're Chayiv. Let's see the Gemara's explanation. Why would Rava say you're Potter? By the way, if we hadn't examined our previous Gemara, I wouldn't call this light reading. But now that we're more or less familiar with the principles, we can visualize, hopefully this more simple. Rava says you're exempt. His mind told his arm to throw a distance of 2 amas. He was not intending to make a throw that is considered a Shabbosly problematic throw. He didn't intend to do what he did. There was no mechaven. It wasn't that he didn't know you can't throw. He knew you can't throw. And that's why he was trying to be very careful. It reminds me actually more like a fair, the fair games where you have to toss the ring on, you have to be very precise in your short distance throwing. So Rava says that's not what you did is not what your mind said to do. It's not what you intended to do. You should therefore not need to bring you're not liable. You don't bring a carbon. Abaya Amar. Abaya predictably is going to say no. Chayiv. Why? Because although what actually happened is not precisely what you intended to do, the action is identical. He intended to throw and he threw. He intended to throw something and he threw it. Similar to our example previously, which was, what was our example about Shabbos previously? You intended to pick something up. You picked something up. This is the first scenario. By Rava, similarly argue about how far we will apply the exemption of misasek lo kamechav. Rashi, dehalo ichaven l'zrika b'isur. The yeheshoyig b'Shabbos. This should be considered the yeheshoyig b'Shabbos. If he intended to throw, that would either be a shoyig or a malacha. Abel ze'ein shoyig. Here, it's not that he didn't know it was a problem. Elo misasek b'davar acher. He intended to throw a short throw, a toss. That's permitted. But also the other isur. So a Rava says it's considered misasek. Yes, Rebero.
You have an element in the throwing that didn't exist before.
Let's hear.
That could be a gust of wind.
Yeah. But here, if I understand correctly, you're right. But here we're imagining there is no gust of wind. Here we're imagining the person simply misthrew or overthrew. Anybody here that's attempted a new sport, or maybe a sport they're not familiar with, or maybe it is a familiar sport, but not everybody's good at a 3-pointer. So surely many of us can imagine that we intend to throw in one way and we throw another way. You thought you're throwing towards the basket. You ever saw a person that they thought they're throwing towards the basket and they're trying to throw and it goes backwards? So it's not unheard of that a person's throw could be different than their intention. So Abaye says a throw is a throw. It's the action. It's a zerika. You intended to throw and you threw in a prohibited manner. No good. That's not misasik. And Rava says no. It was like misasik. Your whole mind said throw there and you threw there. It's like 2 different acts. It's misasik. That is the next area where Abaye and Rava argue. Very similar to our previous discussion. The Gemara is going to tell us what's unique about this. What does this add to the picture? What happens? Kesavar reshus hayachid, v'nimtzes reshus harab. He thinks that he's throwing into the reshus hayachid, and he's probably in a reshus hayachid, so there's no problem. V'nimtzes reshus harab. But it ends up that what he's throwing is he's throwing into the reshus harab. Chayiv Potter. Same issue. Rava Amar Potter. Rava says, hold on. What he had in mind is to throw in the private domain. That what his hands did is different than what his intention is. That's called misasek. There's a total distance between kavana, his brain, and his hands. Abai Amar Chayiv. Abai says, no way. That's not called misasek. Why? Rava Amar Potter. Why does Rava say you're exempt? The haloi mechavin lezrika the yisura. His intention is kosher throwing, permitted throwing. And what he ends up doing is prohibited throwing. Abai says no. We don't break down. We don't break throwing into like subcategories. Permitted throwing, permissible throwing. No, there's a certain act motion that your hand makes when you throw something, and that's what you intended to do. He's throwing. So just like the case of the 2 to 4, Rava is inclined to break up throwing to kosher throwing and unkosher throwing, permitted throwing and not permitted throwing, and Abaye is not inclined to do so. What we have here generally is Abaye and Rava disagreeing about the application of shogeg misasek. He totally does not intend to do what he's doing. So we now have 3 scenarios that Abaye and Rava argue. We have the scenario where the guy is in the garden and he thinks he's picking up a knife. Let's use Rashi, and he's picking up a carrot. He ends up plucking out a carrot or a cucumber. I don't know. We have the case where over there Rava says you thought you're picking up a permissible item, you ended up lifting an unpermissible item. Misasek, your hands didn't do what your brains instructed them. You should be exempt. And Abaye says no. You intended to pick up and you picked up. Chayav. Scenario B. You thought you were going to be able to throw a legally acceptable throwing on Shabbos 2 amis, and you threw 4. Rava says what your brain told your hand was to throw 2 amis. You overthrew. Misasek. Abaye says no way. You intended to throw, and you threw. Chayiv. Lastly, you thought you were throwing from your home into the private domain in a way that's acceptable, but instead of throwing over here, you threw over there. You threw from Reshus Hayachid to Reshus Rabim, from private domain to public domain. Rava says you thought you're going to throw acceptable throwing, you threw an unacceptable throwing. That's called misasek. And Abaye says no way. 3 scenarios, pretty much the same idea. Rava is consistently expansive of his definition of misasek, and Abaye very restrictive. Abaye says we're going to give you this major heter. We're going to let you off the hook from bringing a chatas. Well, there are very limited conditions where that would work. All right, let's pause here for a moment. The Gemara is going to ask a question that is frequent. The Gemara, many times, when you bring the same argument in 3 similar scenarios, the Gemara asks, why are we wasting ink? Repeating the same argument over and over again. Is there a chiddush? Is there something about each scenario that adds to our understanding of their opinion, of their position? That's what the Gemara is going to ask and answer. Now, anybody want to try to guess what is unique about each case? Want to take a stab at it? No pressure. Let's take a look. Yes.
To go completely off subject, just to try to figure out the importance of intention, what if we looked at all this from the other side? He went to cut something, and then at the end the thing was detached from the earth. Does the Talmud deal with the other side of the...
Well, Beryl, you're asking what happens if the guy intends to sin, and thankfully he's saved by the bell.
Right. Good
question. Let's ultimately, if you didn't do the act, there's not going to be the sentence. However, Rebel, if it comes to Chodesh Elul, I'm sure there's some teshuva. Guy, imagine a guy who all he wants to do is sin, and he's thwarted by his inability to throw in a straight line. Poor guy. Doctor?
It's interesting because all of this has to do with intent and kavana, and kavana in terms of adhering to mitzvot on work on Shabbos, basically.
Yeah.
But in the real world, okay, and the consequence is whether or not you bring an offering or not.
Right.
In the real world, regardless of, you could have good kavana, and the important thing is the outcome. In other words, you intended to throw it to the other person in a kosher place, but it went astray and it broke that lamp that's worth $1,000. And we don't say, "Oh, potter," okay? We say, "Yeah, it was you didn't intend it," but there's a consequence to it, and that's
Right.
what the people who are saying when they're saying chayav, they're saying, "Very nice, you didn't intend it, but it happened, and you were the actor involved with initiating and causing it to happen, and there are consequences." So it's an interesting dilemma of.
So in other words, there's somewhat of a distinction between man and man, in Adam L'Makom and Adam L'Chavera, in a sense.
Right.
If you break your friend's item, it doesn't really matter your intention. I mean, it might matter.
It matters. We're sorry, but
In other words, you might not terminate a friendship if a guy made a mistake, as opposed to the guy takes a baseball bat and smashes your windows of your car. If it's intentional, you're going to probably want to terminate that relationship.
Right.
But that is indeed an interesting thing. And I thought you were going to say, you're standing on the line of scrimmage and you throw the ball and you intend to throw to one of your teammates to make a touchdown, and you end up throwing it to the other team, and it's an interception.
Right.
It doesn't matter that your kavana was to throw it to your teammate. You threw the interception. You're not getting celebrated after the game or in that moment, because over there kavana is good,
Right.
but that's not good enough to get the point. So I thought you were going to go there as well.
Only during the season, not during the preseason football.
But that might explain why the Gemara. That might help us appreciate why, even when a person does something inadvertently, ultimately there is a procedure for teshuvah.
Right.
We certainly don't look. Certainly, the severity of a mistake is nowhere near the severity of an intentional act. Certainly, being Adam L'Makom, where kavanah is so much more important. But there's still some value to the action, and I would say perhaps very more spiritually or psychologically, Geret, if we would entirely waive, if the Torah would say a shogeg is entirely off the hook, it would diminish our appreciation for the significance of the act or the significance of avoiding an act. And we could come to engineer shogegs. And so it's possible that creating an enforcement, creating teshuvah for the shogeg helps us appreciate how significant the mitzvot are and how significant it is to try to get things right. Just a thought. Rebel, yes.
Yeah, back to the English expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Indeed. And Rebel, you took us off the road, but you brought us back on it. Shkoyach. Utsricha, the Gemara says each of these three cases are necessary and contribute to our complete picture. The Gemara would only talk about the lifting in the garden case. Maybe that's where Rava would be more broad in his application of misasik. The item that he intended, or he had no intention at all to interact with a prohibited item. When a person is thinking, I'm going to throw 2 amas, and he throws 4 amas, listen carefully, this is interesting. If you throw 4, you necessarily are throwing the distance of 2. And so although your intention was to do the right, to not do something wrong, you intended to throw 2 and you did throw 2. And that 2 became part of an action that threw 4. And so maybe Rava would say, listen, here, your kavanah was part of what you did. And what you did was wrong. So maybe you should be chai. And still, Rava says that you're patur. Again, You thought you're going to throw 2 and you threw 4. The arba below tartilam is darkule. You necessarily need to throw 2 to throw the distance of 4. Maybe here Rava would say, I'm going to say that you have to bring a carbon. This is not considered misasik because you did what you intended and then some. Rashi, the arba below tartilam is darky. The zeshin is kavan l'shtayim. The guy who intends to throw 2 amas, distance of 2 amas, v'zorak arba, nasis machshavtoi. What his hand did and what his head said is possibly in alignment. Maybe we'll take away the misasek defense in such a case. And Rava says, no, even here I will apply the principle of defense of misasek. The arba. No, I'm saying, no. If we would only teach the case of the throwing, I would say maybe b'hakam. Maybe here, you know why Rava says you can use the misasek defense? The halay mechavin the zrika the arba. Your intention is not to throw the distance of 4. You intended to throw an entirely different kind of throw. It's a short. And think about it. In basketball, depending on how far the distance is, it's a whole other point. It's a whole other kind of throwing. So the Gemara says maybe when you throw differently than your intention, that's misasik. It's entirely different, an entirely different act. In the scenario where you thought you were throwing into one domain and you threw into another domain, the distance is exactly as intended. And so maybe here Rava would say you're chai. You intended to throw 4 amas. So even here, basically each case shows us how far Rava is willing to apply the misasek defense. Not only when the entire matter that you were doing is you intend to do was permissible, but even if you're throwing as part of the act of the prohibited act, it still gives you a waiver. And even when you threw exactly the distance that you want, just the direction was different, even then, Rava allows you to employ the misasek defense. And so, my dear friends, that concludes, I'm going to end just a few minutes early, that concludes today's Gemara. Today's Gemara started off with the end of analyzing the Brisa, and so we were compelled to find a scenario where on Shabbos one would be exempt, and with other prohibitions you'd be chayiv. We had to stretch the we had to use our imagination to come up with a scenario where there was a misasek that would work according to Abaya, and that was the case of the saliva swallowing. And then we introduced 2 additional areas where Abaya and Rava disagree in regards to the definition of misasek, namely throwing a greater distance than you intended, or throwing to another place than you intended. And in each of those cases, although they sound very much alike, the Gemara explains why each one contributes to our understanding of how far Rava will go with the misasek defense, again, where your hand is not doing what your head is instructing it to do so. And again, misasek is such a degree of unintentionality that it's not even called shoygeg for the laws of Shabbos. In the laws of Shabbos, we won't call it a shoygeg, and therefore you'd be exempt even from bringing a carbon. So that concludes today's Gemara. I want to thank all of our wonderful friends for taking time out of a Sunday, which in America is considered an off day, and remain devoted and dedicated to studying Torah. Hashem should bless everybody. And actually, let me close out. If I didn't mention it when we started, that we'll dedicate retroactively and for tomorrow, learning l'schus, the speedy and complete recovery for Leah Basrita. It's the mother of a dear friend of the shul and someone who actually recently made a wonderful contribution for our future building. And unfortunately, they found an illness in his mother. Should be complete and total recovery. We take it from Miyad Leah Basrita. And good news for all of Klal Yisrael, and particularly good news for the esteemed holy members of our Gemara Chabur. Thank you all for joining. Thank you for being here. Have a blessed and wonderful day.
Are you staying?